Okay, cool. So we were talking about the religious trends, some of the approaches to studying religion. Does anyone remember anything in particular about last week? Maybe like the different types of religious belief?
Do you mean like that there is, for example, only one God or multiple gods that you believe, or
Yes.
can
Yes,
we?
that would be an example.
Is it like monotheism? Or monotheism?
Yes, monotheism is the belief in one God. There's also, and I mentioned also that there's sometimes this differentiation between monotheism and monism, and it's one that I don't like to make. And the difference is monotheism is basically the worship of one God, and monism is when you have this kind of unifying belief where like everything, like, so basically it's like a unity of everything, and everything you live, you experience, everything in the world, in the universe is a part of God. So the natural world is all an expression of God. So it's all like, let's say we're all in God's mind, but beyond that, it's everything we experience is part of that oneness. Now, some people differentiate that. I don't like to do that so much. I think it's just a part of monotheism, and I mean, there are some people that see God as outside of the universe, and we're kind of in the creation, but it's just a variation of monotheism. Anything else from last week? Where we left off, we talked about societies, cultures, because I asked that because today we will be focusing primarily on the, let's say, societies and cultural approach. So going a little bit into looking at groups and environments and how that impacts religion. Anything else, and or we can go. And today we will be doing quite a few activities. So like last time with the breakout rooms and such. So let's begin and look at societies and culture. So when we talk about societies, we mentioned this last time a little bit. We have the early, and these you can see as progressions, although that is not always the case. But let's look at hunter-gathering societies, hunter-gathering and foraging tribes. And these are very often nomadic groups that go from place to place and are these groups are usually associated with polytheism and very often matriarchal societies. We move into the agricultural societies, and in different parts of the world, how that varies. For example, in let's say parts of Mesopotamia, what was ancient Mesopotamia and the Middle East, and the growth of grains like wheat, millet, versus let's say East Asian societies, where the primary crop was rice, and how that changes the way people interact with each other in terms of work on the fields or in the rice paddies. And you will see that has a big impact on the overall societies. Agricultural societies are usually associated with feudalism, so kingdoms and more, let's say, monarchic rule. We move to industrial societies based on industry. So the power also shifts from, let's say, land owners to factory owners. And then we move to what is called post-industrial societies, which is largely connected with certain economic situation where industry is sent to other countries that are still, we call, developing. So in those terms, it is kind of look like these models are seen as an evolution. So, and in the future, after post-industrial, I don't know if there is a future category you can think of some. That the most important part for this class to think about are the different types of ideologies, religions and value systems that arise. So can you give some example of a, let's say, ideology that is relevant to, well, agricultural societies versus an industrial society? So think of in the industrial societies and philosophies that have come about. What would be even like an economic system that is prominent in industrial societies?
Capitalism.
Good. So capitalism is a perfect example. And
Maybe open market.
Open market, so like the free market.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that the free market also ties in very strongly with post-industrial, because if you have a free market and a, let's say, you don't have so many rules in place, you could move your industry to places where you pay your workers less and produce goods, you produce the products. And out of that, you can see like an example of ideologies like Marxism would arise from the industrial societies. From the post-industrial societies, when we are covered in goods and we're, I don't know if we could call it spoiled, but we are, our values shift. We see things like postmodern thinking, deconstruction, when people have time to think about, oh, let's get to the basics of these and let's undo and this is kind of interesting. And in terms of agricultural society, that's where most of the religions are come from, are from agricultural societies. And in terms of Western culture, most of the most prominent religions that are still very influential today arise from the Middle East and Northern Africa, obviously. So I would like to mention that we look at climate exposure to disease, impact, violence, in-group loyalty, and the moral structures. How many of you have read Guns, Germs, and Steel? If you are not familiar with it, or how many of you have never heard of this book?
I didn't.
Okay, good. So I will share with you a video just to give you an idea of the theory and how, let's say, the Eurasian culture basically evolved, and the things like exposure to disease, being close to cattle, like in the Middle East and Europe, people were living very close to cows and other animals, and they were exposed to disease, and they've evolved to let's say, a different immune system than certain people, let's say, in the Americas, where they had a very different way, like a more nomadic lifestyle. Not all of them, but a lot of tribes. So when Europeans went there, a lot of people became very ill, and their immune systems were not used to, or they didn't have any immunity for certain diseases like the common cold. So let's talk about, and this is where we get into the concept from cultural psychology, but this is important when we start to look at religions and the different, let's say, cultures and subcultures. And in terms of definitions, I want to mention that I don't want to confuse you too much, but a lot of these definitions that are written here have two definitions. So I'll give you the first one. So the first one is a separate culture, and this relates to usually a subculture, subcultural group that is generally not assimilated, meaning it's not taking the habits, the customs of the mainstream culture, has separate institutions like schools, shops, and things like that, and basically rejects the mainstream society's culture. Can anyone think of a group like this in any society?
I don't know what is the name, but I know that in the US there are some groups that they just like completely live independent life from everybody else. They even,
Yes.
I think, grow their own things not to interfere with other people, but I forgot the name.
Yes, there's a couple of
I
groups
think
like
Amish.
yes,
Yeah, that's
correct.
what I was thinking.
Correct. That's right. So the Amish would be a great example of that. The Amish and another group is called the Mennonites, and they are basically a Christian group that is a separate culture, and they believe that the correct way of living for humans is to be agricultural societies, that technology should not be at the forefront of our values. And so they are basically separate, and there's all other examples. Could be like the ultra orthodox Jewish communities. Sometimes even in Brooklyn, they have their own institutions. They have their own schools. They don't put their kids in public schools and things like that. Now, not to confuse you, but in the case of immigration, we have the same term, separation, and it's when people come to a new culture and completely reject their previous cultural background. So you can think of if somebody, let's say, moves from I don't know, Turkey to Czech Republic, and let's say it's a man with his family, and he says, I'm not going to speak Turkish anymore to my kids. I want them to be Czech. So that would be an example of separation, and it's something that happened quite a lot in terms of migration to the United States in the 20th century. There was kind of this approach of just pure assimilation, and that takes us to assimilation, which again has two definitions. One is what I gave you now, like if somebody, let's say, totally gives up their previous culture, takes in just the host culture's traditions and values, that would be the classic definition of assimilation. The multicultural approach of assimilation, so let's say we are in a place that accepts multiculturalism as a way of being. That means that the assimilation process is something like this. It's I'm coming to Czech, I'm moving to Czech Republic. I accept, let's say, the core values, the laws and stuff of Czech Republic, but I still maintain my old, like part of my old cultural heritage. So just because I become Czech or Czech citizen doesn't mean I have to, pronounce myself an atheist and give up my religious background or or my traditional garb, let's say. So that's those are the same name for two different concepts, and I wrote there that it's a two-way street. And what I mean by that is, in order for assimilation to work in terms of the multicultural approach, you have to be willing to accept the culture that you're moving into, and the culture has to be willing to accept you and your, let's say, your traditional approaches. It can't be, it doesn't work without those. So, and it hasn't been fully tried, I would say. The worst of outcomes is marginalization. And while I'm saying these things, just always keep in mind like the religious connotations and like if there are certain types of religious views or beliefs that could be connected with any of these groups, and we just gave two examples with the Mennonites, Amish. Marginalization is basically, the best way of putting it is, the person is not accepted into the host culture, and the person is also cut off or no longer connected with their original culture of origin. And now, in terms of religions, I gave religious affiliations. Can anyone think of some example? And it can be, you can think of even like more recent movements of religions that would be open to the marginalized or would welcome the marginalized.
I was thinking it in the opposite way, that, for example, now the immigrants coming from Middle East to Europe, that they will be marginalized. Isn't like that? Is it that they will be kind of, we don't want to accept them, and they kind of, if they're, for example, in a small country like in Slovakia, let's say, that there is no group they can associate because there are not many people of them to create their community.
That could be like that could be an example, like let's say a Middle Eastern immigrant is in Slovakia and has no community. Well, it makes it harder, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee marginalization. Marginalization is really when also when you are cut off from your previous culture, so you are even like, you don't care anymore even about your religion, for example. But it's basically, yeah, there is an aspect of rejection from the host culture. Now, you gave now as an example, and I would say that now with this virus and this emergency situation, that yes, you have, now it's not the best time for somebody to be an immigrant or a refugee, and we can see that happening. There's even people who were more accepting a few months ago, now are in a totally different mindset. So, but I was thinking in terms of like a religion. So a religion for people that are on the margins. Do you have any examples of that? Okay.
For me, the only example is but I see it in your example also, like Romani people in Czech Republic, but in Slovakia, I think it's also the same thing. So for me, from my country, that's what comes to my mind.
Okay. And Romani people are very often associated with Catholicism, with Roman Catholicism. They often also have a role in the church. Like I don't know if it's the same in Slovakia, but in Italy they are often the people who take care of the churches. They clean. They also are specialized in shining the let's say the metal objects or things of that sort. And they have quite a close connection. I had a colleague who works in Poland. He's a psychologist, and he was working with the Romani communities, and specifically the Romani people that are not marginalized but have their own separate cultures. So they have like their own king.
Yeah.
You've heard of this? Yeah. So he knows that culture very well, and he was saying, and they have a lot of tradition and religious ideals in it. And it's interesting because they came from India. They are mostly their background is Indian, and they were from a very low caste in India. And so a lot of these people from lower castes in Hindu society have actually left or have converted. They convert to religions that are a little bit more universal. So like Christianity and Islam are the two main religions that they converted into. So that's interesting. I was thinking in terms of modern societies. I don't know if anybody's heard of the religious sect in Mexico called Santa Muerte, which is kind of an offshoot of Catholicism. It's kind of, I mean, it's not mainstream. It's like the worshiping of this saint of death to give good luck, and it's associated with criminals and people who are addicted to drugs and people like that. That would be an example of religion for the marginalized, and it's not as fringe as you may think. It's actually quite prominent, and you have shrines of Santa Muerte throughout Mexico and even in the United States. In some places, you have in California and Texas some of these shrines. So that's pretty interesting in my opinion. Okay, let's talk about the people in societies, the ethnicity, races, etc. What are the statistics now? And I will give you an activity for this. So when we talk about like the different ethnic groups, and especially in terms of religious belief, that's what I'm interested in. So in terms of the idea of race, it's basically noted distinctions genetically passed down, like skin tone, and it's based on the environment that people evolved in, obviously based on the weather and things of that nature. Now, a lot of the terminology is very outdated and inaccurate. So I give an example, like the terms Semitic. Does anyone know where that term comes from? It's actually from religion. No, so in terms of that terms comes from the people of Shem in from Genesis and the different people that God created. So it's not a very scientific term, and also this concept is it doesn't always hold up to the correct, let's say, definition in science. We did have previous like true races, like in terms of the Neanderthal, which were also hominoid people. The Denisovans, I don't know if any of you have heard of this hominoid group, but quite interestingly, today we know that these other true different races, like the Neanderthals, mixed with a lot of people, with a lot of Homo sapiens, and also the Denisovans, who were considered giants. They were quite tall peoples, and and you can find some of their DNA in some of the Native American tribes in the northeast of the United States. And it's very interesting because throughout religious traditions, you have tales of the giants, and in certain traditions, you even have the Garden of Eden as not as the people like Adam and Eve as not being the only people, meaning outside the garden, there were other types of hominoids or other types of people, which is quite interesting if you look at it from this perspective. And in the examples of the Mohawk tribes, they have a lot of these giants, these very tall people, and a lot of legends about the interaction between giants and people. So it's quite interesting how this ties into, let's say, popular, let's say folk culture and traditions. In terms of ethnicities, we are talking about like an ethnic groups as ancestry, language, and very often religious affiliation. And you can see that this we will go quickly. And you can also learn a lot about different cultures by the way they like the different people identify or classify themselves. So this was from about 10 years ago now, but you can see like how people in Czech Republic, which is a very small country, it has only like 10.5 million people, so it's got the same population as New York City, more or less. But you can see like the ethnicity. So some people call themselves Moravian, a little bit funny. And the religious background, very, very minimal, unspecified, and nuns, we're almost 80% there. So quite impressive, or over 80%.
I
This
have
is
a
the,
question.
yeah,
So what does exactly mean unspecified?
where? Oh,
Uh,
unspecified.
yeah.
It means that either they didn't answer, or they gave they gave some kind of their own answers. Like there were a lot of people who answered like some Star Wars reference.
Okay.
So it was, yeah. So Czech Republic, a very irreligious country. Now look at the ethnicity, how the ethnic groups are divided, and then this is the United States from the latest census, which will soon become outdated because there's going to be a new census. And this is how the US government labels people in the US. So you have the ethnicities, white Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Amerindians, Alaska Natives, and et cetera, et cetera. And you can see how that's kind of a very big, like the United States is almost obsessed with these race based groups rather than ethnic groups. So, for example, in the white populations, you would find Arab Americans, and then the different types of, let's say, lighter skinned individuals like Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, all sorts of people of European and Middle Eastern background. Black as well. If you go to Africa, for example, which is a huge continent, you will find that there are more ethnicities, more ethnic groups than in Europe or than in Asia. So it's the U.S. makes a very how can I say, like it's very broad categories that they use. Now, in terms of religion, this is quite known. Protestantism, Protestant Christianity is the #1 religion, and it has a very strong cultural impact. Now, I want to do this activity. So, and I will be dividing you like last time. So before I start, are there any questions in what I've covered so far? Okay, that's fine. So I want you to look over this task, and basically you pick 1 or 2 subcultures. You can do one. First of all, what I would like you to do is think of a country, and the subcultures, they don't need to be only now. They don't have to be like subcultures that are in existence today. They can be subcultures from the past. And this is something that you can think of for your future presentation. So for example, in Czech Republic, in Bohemia, there was a group called the Adamites, which were a subculture and religious group that was basically a commune-based Christian group of nudists that were then wiped out by not the Catholics, but I believe by the Hussites, and so that would be an example of an experiment, a subculture, and a separate culture, peaceful, that believed in this kind of nudist, natural love approach. So let me see, and yeah, and find their religious belief. You can look at some that I mentioned, like the Mennonites, the Amish are open, but just please choose beforehand, and I will just exit. And so, and you can find like maybe find some factors, some things about them. If there are examples like in terms of health and well-being, and I will throw another one out for you. The Seventh-day Adventist movement in the United States is the most healthy subcultural and religious group there in terms of longevity and mental health. So, and the first thing, and I will go to the meeting. So the first thing is to decide on a country. And okay, so welcome back. So we will talk about these are the 4 types of knowledges that are in cultural and cross-cultural psychology, but they're very relevant to the psychology of religion, especially when we look at activities like the one you just did. And these are the 4 knowledges. There's the scientific, the popular or folk knowledge, ideological, and legal knowledge. So in terms of scientific knowledge, we're talking about quantitative knowledge, so things related to, let's say, measurable outcomes. So we can look at specific communities, like somebody before was mentioning Ashkenazi Jews and certain genetic diseases that are transmitted down the line. So that would be an example. We could look at something like the Seventh-day Adventists in the United States and their good health outcomes due to their diet. They are often vegetarians, and they follow. They also have a strong community, so they're close and have support. In terms of popular wisdom, these are basically things that may fall under the category of superstitious belief or popular explanations for certain phenomena. So, for example, I gave the example last week of understanding mental health phenomena from a religious or a spiritual perspective. So if a particular culture sees demons, for example, as a cause for certain conditions, well, that would be an example of folk knowledge. And very interestingly, this demon-based approach actually can work even in mainstream therapy, especially with people who suffer from schizophrenia. So religious-based approaches are actually quite good for these people. And so the understanding their voices as some kind of a demon actually helps. And maybe some of you are surprised by that. But that would be an example. The ideological is basically like what kind of ideology are basically found in each culture as well as reinforced. And you can put, change culture to religion and what ideologies the religion gives. And we can think of things like virtues and vices, right? So what is right and what is wrong, and the legal knowledge. And this is very interesting because very often in culture and religion go hand in hand. So the laws will be influenced by the religion. And I'll give you an example. So in the United States, one of the most polarizing topics, which is pretty much evenly split among people, is the issue of abortion. And abortion, and the people who are against abortion very often are Christian, and they see it as kind of overstepping or stepping the line in terms of what is murder. but also the notion of it's not you who decides, it should be the will of God. Now, I can give you another example. Sometimes religious law and the state law may clash. So I have a friend in Turkey, and she was telling me about how many communities, rural communities, have marriages that very often involve girls who may be underage and older men. And she was saying, in terms of the culture, it's acceptable, but the law does not accept these things. So there's a clash. And I can tell you from Italy, in terms of the religious approach of marriage, let's say the Roman Catholic approach, would be the same. So it would be acceptable for the Roman Catholic Church if you have a, let's say, a 30-year-old man marrying a 15-year-old girl. That would be acceptable by religious standards, but it would not be acceptable by the state's standards. So sometimes they clash. And this is something to keep in mind. Now, I don't want to divide you into the groups again, but I just would like to hear some feedback from you right now. If you have some examples of folk knowledge, superstition, or examples of what I just mentioned, for example, in terms of the laws or religious law and secular law, how they clash or how they work together. So let's just stick with that. Does anyone have any examples?
My grandma used to say that upon sunset you should turn on the lights so the angels could come into the house.
It's very interesting. That's the first time I've heard that one.
It's mostly mystical superstition.
Yes.
I don't believe it, but she used to say that.
Yes. So that's yeah, it's interesting. And one thing to keep in mind is that superstitions are often like satellites to the religion. It's like the religion, let's say like maybe Islam or Christianity may not accept these superstitions, but they kind of follow it around. And it's like hard to say where they start. So that's a good one. I can give you one from Italy. So if you this is one that brings bad luck. So in Italy, there's a very big fear of dropping a bottle of olive oil. If you smash olive oil, like if you break it, it's supposed to bring bad luck to your family. And so people are extremely careful with that. And it's interesting, of all things, olive oil, but olive oil has been like the base often of ointments as well, and it has medicinal properties. So it's bad luck to do that. Any other traditions, maybe Czech ones?
I'm being confused because does it have to be connected to religion? Because there are a lot of traditions, but I cannot come up with something religious.
No, it doesn't need to be religious. As I said, these things can be like they can be connected to religion somehow. Like olive oil, it's not necessarily out of religion, but in religion there's the ointments, and the holy oils are very often made of an olive base.
I know, like I don't know if it comes from Slovakia, but even in my family they used to do it, because we have especially women in my family are very how can I say, sensitive to some people, that they can kind of take so much energy, that my grandma used to just faint in the middle of the street when somebody was looking at her in some specific way, that they are very like they become very weak. So there was kind of a tradition that when it happened, then we were luckily at home, that it happened somehow at home. that you will fill a cup and you will light a match. And I think you will do it 3 times. And if it was a woman, if it was a man, or if it was some spirit or something like that, and you will light the match and then throw it to that water. And if it floats or if it dives, there is some meaning, but I don't know now how it works. But even I know that this was sometimes practiced.
That's a very interesting one. That's and it's very magical. I have some things that are interesting for me in terms of folk knowledge and folk traditions like this is when there's commonalities. So I'll give you an example, another one from Italy, which is recurs in other cultures, and in Italy, in certain parts of the country, or actually most of the country, when somebody says something bad or something that may bring bad luck, there's the tradition, or if somebody talks about death, there's the tradition of doing this sign with the hand, like the horns. You know, if you see like the heavy metal sign, that you do that when somebody says it's supposed to bring away bad luck. And interestingly, in many Buddhist traditions, that sign is supposed to be a sign, a mudra for good luck, to keep away the evil spirits. So that's interesting. Also, the tradition of the evil eye. Have you heard of that?
No.
If somebody gives you the evil eye, it's supposed to bring bad luck, and then you're supposed to purify yourself against these things, against this. And
yeah, we do that in Greece as well. And the old grandmas know some prayers.
yes.
That they sing.
Very often. Yeah, very often there's prayers, and that you find in I know for sure in Christianity and in Islam, there's these traditions of the prayers for against these evil eye or against this bad luck or curses, right? The notion of curses, somebody cursed you.
Actually,
Go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I have 2 more examples. It just came to my mind now. One is really common in Slovakia. I don't know how is it in Czech Republic or in Europe, that when a child is born, and the first time, or like you should not go out with the child for 3 months or something like that. And but the most important part is that even in my family and a lot of friends are practicing that they put something on the child, like sock or not head, like t-shirt or something other way around, that it's supposed to protect the child from other people when they are looking at him, like kind of cursing or like taking energy, that they always put some cloth the other side around.
That's very interesting.
It's really common. And then second thing, when I was in Sri Lanka, they practice this, cursing people is very common. Even it happens, especially from these subgroups. There are some special, either Christian or I think it's Buddhist, but they are not original. I mean, there are some subgroups, and they practice this cursing so much. And even in my my boyfriend's family, it happened because they put, for example, to your garden, kind of like a dead fish. And when you then somehow you get to know, because either some cat will bring it or somehow you find it, so you know that somebody cursed you. And then there are special rituals that a person would come, and they are, first of all, they are doing like some mantra, they are saying some mantras. And after that also they are cutting, for example, limes on your head with some special knife or something like that. And they are throwing those limes into a bucket full of water. And then I don't know exactly what that specific person is doing, but he's saying something. And then he knows somehow who cursed you when the lime is floating again or like it's diving. So it was very magical, and it was very interesting. Even I experienced it myself.
Wow. No, that's fascinating. I can tell you, I have a friend, actually it's funny, another friend of mine from Turkey. She was dating a man from Africa, and I'll make a long story short, but anyways, they had some problems with family, with his family, and apparently somebody gathered to make a curse on her. And now, whether you believe it or not, I can guarantee you that she had some very, very bad effects. Now, if it was her own mind creating these or what it was, I don't know, but she had severe health problems and she had this recurrent depression, and she went back to Turkey, so they split up, and she was with an imam for, I don't know, like a month or so, and doing prayers and getting rid of this curse. So whether you believe it or not, it doesn't matter. What mattered was it was real for her. So those are all good examples. And there are actually places where like this type of cursing is actually very common. And a lot of tribes, places like in Africa, they have this tradition and how to put a curse and how to get rid of a curse. And even in Europe, we have this tradition more going back, I would say. You can see it in Italy as well. And you can see it from all these little rituals and specific knowledge that people have. So very good. Now, scientific research, I already mentioned a few, but do you have any examples of religious and secular law clashing or getting along?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So I just started thinking about one example from my city in Sweden. In 2002, there was a case of a young woman. She was born in the Kurdish part of Turkey, but she moved with her family to Sweden in the 80s. And she, like her family's background, like they belong to, I wouldn't call it a sect, but like a very, very traditionalist minority within the Kurdish population. And so the common thing within this minority is that you marry like within the family. So you marry your cousin or similar.
Yeah.
And when she came to Sweden, she after she graduated high school, she got a Swedish boyfriend. And this created a lot of problems within her family.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to do everything to stop it. And, you know, because it's really common that you, what is it called? Like you arrange marriage within the family.
Yes,
Yeah.
intermarriage.
Exactly. And so she found this Swedish boyfriend, and it was a lot of troubles within the family because of this. And eventually it went so far that her father killed both her and her boyfriend. And for them this was normal because within the culture it's like a law that you marry within your family, and she didn't do that. So they went so far to kill her and the boyfriend. And of course this, like in Sweden, he got sentenced to 20 years in prison. So this was just an example I came to think of, where it clashed between the two.
Sure, that's terrible.
Yeah, it's really terrible indeed. It's very terrible.
Wow. I know a similar story in Italy about and this was in my area. I was actually there when it happened. I mean, I was in the area, and there was a Pakistani girl who was dating an Italian boy, and the family didn't approve it at all, and she was saying, well, I want to move out. And basically in her family the tradition was that the father would pick the husband, right? They would do it more in a traditional way. And what ended up happening was she said, no, I'm going to leave, I'm going to live with my Italian boyfriend, and that's it. And basically her father killed her and tried to kill her boyfriend but wasn't able to. And yeah, so that was another very tragic story. Now, whether that was purely religious, cultural, a different story. But in terms of general, let's try to, so these are very specific. In terms of generalities, we do have many, you know, let's say congruences between religious law and secular law. So can you think of any? Like, I'll give you a quick, like the 10 Commandments from the Bible. Well, they line up pretty well with certain laws, right? Like you shall not steal, shall not kill, right? So there's some also congruences. All right, so let's move on. These were all good examples, and these other parts, the scientific knowledge, we will cover more, and you will do more with your research and presentation. I want to mention the cultures, so traditional cultures and non-traditional. When we talk about traditional cultures, these are obviously the cultures based on traditions, values that are handed down generation from generation. Non-traditional cultures are the modern and postmodern, and it's basically, rather than keeping up with the old tradition, it's making new, and very often the driving force is technology. Hence, we can remember like the Amish example of rejecting the modern world. Now, one good way that I think is that can tell you how these two groups, let's call them the moderns and the traditionals, how they vary greatly is this. The traditional religions and the traditional cultures basically see the golden age as being in the past. So there was people basically fell from grace, let's say. They were living in Eden, and then they degenerated. And so the best way to, let's say, to have a good functioning society is to stick to the laws and the wisdom of the elders, of the people who wrote the books or got the inspiration from God or the gods to write these books. Whereas the modern are saying, no, we will change. And very often they're associated with liberalism, and at times no. So an example would be let's say, more democratic states versus Chinese communism, Chinese communist state, which is still a modern culture, but it is a culturally tight and illiberal culture where there's authoritarianism, but still innovation in terms of technology. And postmodern, as I said, it's related to that. Like, we are no longer we are beyond industrialized. We've moved industries elsewhere, and now we have the technology, we have the goods, but we are kind of in this relativistic state, and a lot of the postmodern ideology has everything to do with relativity, like relativism in terms of truth. So whereas let's say, a lot of the philosophical traditions, let's imagine ancient Greeks, we're looking at, okay, how do we get to the truth with a big T? And and by the way, this notion has influenced all Western traditions and even partly Eastern traditions. But let's say, like, even the three monotheistic faiths of the West, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all were influenced by these types of philosophies. And so all have this notion that there is a truth with a big T, and we have all of us have a different perspective, but it's not like each of us has their own truth with a T. It's just different perspectives. And postmodern would disagree and say, no, everyone has their own truth. So that's very important to understand and differentiate. So we can see like some of the examples here. So behaviors and roles. You know, so there's like truth, especially as an established concept, not up to debate. Good and evil are clearly defined in the traditional cultures. And yeah, these are some examples. Now, think of the moderns, were basically people who have like an enlightenment type value. But one thing that that is hard to deny is that basically, even when you are basically rebelling against everything and you know, getting rid of religion, a lot of the base, let's say, a lot of the structure that you're building upon has been greatly created by the traditionals. And even though people may not like to acknowledge that, that's the reality. And one of the things that is, and this might seem a little biased, but one of the things that is creating a lot of confusion in the postmodern thinking is that they are starting to lose the footing, the grounding under their feet. When you just start deconstructing and you start to relativize everything, it becomes very difficult then to have a coherent order to live your life by. So that's something to think about. Now,
Can I add something?
Sure.
That's a particularly a debate, or not a debate, a conversation I had with a friend of mine. He's an atheist. He's from the Netherlands. I told him that no matter how much Europe is now secularized, and I know no matter how much Europe now has departed from religion, I think Europe is still deeply religious, and it is still deeply like Christianity and Judaism. The Judeo-Christianic principles and ethics are deeply incorporated within the communities and the societies, and even within the scientific prospect or the scientific movement that is flourishing in Europe more than anywhere else in the world, except for America. So my reason for that thinking is that as you said, the base upon which the European cultures and societies were built is Judeo-Christianic. For example, their appreciation for the inherited value within each and every human being, their advertising of democracy, even capitalism. I was reading about Max Weber yesterday, and capitalism can be seen as the ultimate eventuality of practicing Protestantism.
Yes.
So that's what I would.
Yeah, those are all great points, and I fully agree. And yes, Max, I'm familiar with Weber's argument that the capitalist ideology or way of engaging with the world is basically the Protestant work ethic put into practice. And so yes, very good points, and I would agree. And I would say that this idea also of faith and reason in terms of religion and philosophy and like reasoning goes really, really far back. And I mean, farther, like 3,000 years ago, we could already see this in terms of were called the two biggest influences. So you can think of these as the two pillars of a lot of Western culture. They were the two cities, which were Athens, Greece, and Jerusalem. And Athens, Greece was the, let's say, the reason, and Jerusalem was the faith. And so, and this was interesting, like in the history of Judaism, for example, a lot of Jews were exiled, or they didn't have a place, and they were basically in Greece, and they were engaging and like mixing, let's say, the tradition, the religious traditions with the argumentational skills and reasoning skills of the Greeks, and then coming back, and the the Jews in Jerusalem were just like very, very dogmatic. But these two pillars have greatly influenced, and not just like European, but also like the Islamic world. And so it's a very interesting thing to think about. But I don't want to go too much off topic. I will go back now to traditionalism and this movement, which is very prominent, and I think it will be, you will see it more and more. And it started off as, I mean, it didn't start off then, but let's say it was popularized in the early 20th century. And it's basically associated and looking at going back to orthodoxy in terms of religion and traditional philosophies. And it's basically, and you can see some of the core beliefs here. It's basically saying that let's say, the orthodox traditions of all religions have certain primal truths, which are called the perennial truths and perennial wisdoms, and these include kind of like this kind of intuition, like divine intuition, and it's something that comes about, according to this philosophy, by doing the prayers, by studying the holy books and maintaining these traditions. So, for example, Muslims like praying 5 times a day, doing, going to Mecca. Like all these traditions are valid and all have certain truth to them. And now this philosophy maintains that all religions have a piece of the truth. But this doesn't mean that we should be eclectic with it. It doesn't mean that we should say, oh, well, I'm going to take this piece of Islam and mix it with this Buddhist mantra. So that's not it at all. That's actually the antithesis of traditionalism. And it's what what the school of thought was up against with these other more, let's say, New Age movements. And we will get into that in a second. But this school of thought sees modernity as degradation and based on very superficial ideas of truth. So, for example, they would see this idea of science as trying to, like pure science, trying to explain the world as very limited. So it doesn't mean they're anti-science, but they see like, okay, science can be taken from a broader perspective and doesn't need to negate the traditions. And we can see some of the important thinkers, René Guénon, Julius Evola, who was very controversial. More recent ones include people like Houston Smith, Hossein Nasr, and many more. And I don't know if any of you have heard of any of these writers. Hossein Nasr he published the study Quran, which is a very like annotated translation, which is really good because it gives context and history of what was going on. And he's basically a traditionalist Muslim scholar who's also writing about ecology and how tradition and let's say an environmental approach can go hand in hand. And now, interestingly, the study of comparative religion came about because of these traditionalist thinkers. So looking and comparing the different traditions and the different religions to see the commonalities and the differences. So are there any questions so far about this? Okay, good. So, and we will just compare this with kind of the modern and postmodern approach to religion. So basically, we have the these are the opposites. So as one school of philosophy is pushing that we should stick with the tradition, but one thing that I forgot to mention is important is the traditionalists did not believe that let's say one school of thought or one tradition is better than another, or that the traditions should be antagonizing each other. They believe in coexistence, but just in a different way. They believe that if I'm an Orthodox Christian and you're a Muslim, we should respect each other for our differences, but still maintain our tradition, and that eventually we can get along more by sticking with our tradition rather than I don't know, making making this kind of secular ideal of tolerance. I don't know, something like this. But in terms of the postmodern and modern, so the idea is that truth is relative, and that basically you can be, and this is what we see a lot today, like you can be like you can pick and choose what you like about your tradition. You can say, well, you know, I like this prayer in Catholicism, but I'm not going to believe in original sin. That's just an example. And so this is a pragmatic approach to religion, and we will talk about this more when we cover William James in 2 weeks, I believe. Yes, this I already mentioned, and the modernist approach is Unitarian, and the traditional is classical, so stick with what is given generation by generation. Some important influences, and don't underestimate these, because they've had quite a impact on culture, especially Western culture. So the Theosophical Society brought a lot of the Hinduism and Buddhism to the West, and not in the most accurate way very often. They would kind of romanticize the tradition and look at it in like these rosy colored glasses. And I mean, certain practices that in the West were completely taboo. So for instance, cremating the dead, burning the dead, as far back as the mid 1800s was completely taboo, and this became acceptable thanks to this group and their influence. And they say, well, in the East they do this, and it's also more hygienic, and et cetera, and this became very widespread in Europe and the United States. So yeah, and other more recent postmodern examples of new religions, we have a Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Has anyone heard of this? Or I don't know, new religions, new modern and postmodern traditions, which kind of get rid of the dogma and make kind of popular poppy type of spirituality. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, these are related to the societies, and we don't need to go over it so much. Now, some of you have already seen these concepts, right, from Hofstede. How many of you have not?
I haven't.
Okay, so we will go over it just quickly, and this is important in terms of looking at different cultures, different societies. So Hofstede divided these 6 concepts, these 6 cultural dimensions. The first one we look at is power distance, and it's basically how each culture deals or accepts the power distribution, which is often or always uneven. And so how certain hierarchies are accepted. And this can be like in terms of social norms, would be something like if you have a higher power distance, you would tend to use more formal titles for people you're talking to. And if I was a like if I'll just use this example, if you're speaking to me and we have a high power distance culture, you would call me doctor at all times, and if you didn't, it would be very taboo. It would be something inappropriate, and I can see this, like for example, in difference between Czech and American culture. Czech culture has a higher power distance than American culture in terms of social norms. In terms of other things like wealth inequality, well, that could be a different topic, and that can be a confound for this theory as well, because if we're looking at sociological factors, it can be one thing, and if we're looking at social norms, it's another thing. Individualism, now moving on, individualism and collectivism. We have individual cultures where people are representing themselves, thinking of their own best interest, versus a collective culture where people are representing their family, their religious group, or their tribe. And so when they do something good, it looks good on their family. They do something bad, it's bringing shame to the family. The masculine and feminine, so this is based on cultures, some that are more, let's say, put more emphasis on being assertive, being courageous, like all these, let's say, stereotypical male attributes, versus the feminine, more caring, more egalitarian. And here you can think of differences like in places like the United States versus Sweden. So you look at a more competitive culture versus a culture that has strong emphasis on everybody being taken care of. So those would be examples. Uncertainty avoidance relates to certain like how traditions are kept, actually, that things should happen the same way. If something is ambiguous, then people feel uncomfortable. And long-term and short-term orientation relate to how people, and you can look at this in terms of people, so how people are living their lives in terms of putting planning for short-term goals versus long-term goals. And this is another interesting one that I noticed with students. If I ask my American students certain goals, they often give me short-term, and Czech students very often have very clearly defined plans in terms of what they're going to do, and like buying a house or something like that, which I always found very impressive. And then the last one is indulgence versus restraint. So how much does a culture, or do people value things like pleasure and things like, rewards like food and I don't know, drinking, whatever, these types of things, versus restraint, which is cultures that place higher emphasis on self-control and things like that, and maybe delaying gratification. Okay, other concepts that are important in culture are the time perception. So things like monochronic and polychronic time. And monochronic time is what we're currently living on. And if you've noticed, we started the class at 12. I was there. Everybody, well, most of you were there on time. It's basically where everybody is sharing the same measure of time, and very often it's measured by a clock. So, and how would that, we're so, I guess, conditioned by that it's hard to see it a different way. So how would it be, like, how would you not do that? Well, in polychronic time, it often relates to, if you want to go to an extreme, if we are like farmers, for example, we don't need a clock. We say, well, the sun is rising, so I'm getting up. The spring is coming. So it's more like related to landmarks, or like things like the sun rising, the stars. Or it can be like understood like this, that there's different times for certain events. So if I'm out at a lunch in Italy, there's a very different type of time perception and rules than if I'm at work. So the time, like lunch can be 12, lunch break in Italy can be 12 to 3. And so it's expected that, they will be longer. And so it's not, the time perception changes. And the opposite would be like a very like stereotypical German or Swiss, where everything has to be by the dot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Cultural trust relates to how much people trust one another, and this can relate to like how I trust you as a fellow citizen, as well as institutions. So how much can I trust that the government is not lying to me, or how much can I trust the police, things of that nature. The locus of control, so it's how much of my behavior and outcome is based on my own behavior, or my own, how much can I influence the outcomes of events, versus how much does are events influenced by external forces. And the last one that is important is the cultural tightness and cultural looseness. And this is related to social norms. And basically a culturally tight society has strong expectations. So right now, I give you an example of a culturally tight, which I'm not judging, but is very relevant, is the masks. Like if you're not wearing masks now, you will probably be punished. So there's this norm, which hopefully is short term, about wearing masks. That's social, like culturally tight. It can be taken, that's a simple and temporary example, but think of other norms that would be reinforced. And cultural tight is basically conformity very often. And culturally loose is people kind of do their own things. And it's more individualistic in this term. And very often you have, in terms of statistically speaking, you can have even higher crime rate, culturally loose places, but more kind of individual freedom. So all examples. Any questions about this? Okay, so I was actually, I can move the video activity for next week, and we can finish with this, like finish with this activity that you will do, and I can divide you. So let me see how much time we have. We have 30 minutes, and what I would like you to do is actually, I will split you up again into the breakout rooms, and you can I will write a post on e-learning so that you can write down and respond these questions there. And let me just